right, at this time I would like to have the previous speakers come up to the stand here, and we'll have a 15-minute discussion for those that have questions in the room. So I think we have Julian and Gustavo will be grabbing some mics, and if you have questions, maybe put your hand up so they can see you clearly and get the microphone to you. And then I believe Dr. Johnson is coming in on a Zoom link here live. Looking for somebody in the back to nod at me that, yeah, that's happening. Perfect. Okay. All right.
Hello, everybody. Apologies for not being able to be there in person.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks for being on, Clayton. Greatly appreciated. Any questions? I saw a microphone change hands back there. Not yet. I'll ask one while everybody's thinking here. You know, Dr. Johnson, when you were having that discussion, I think there was, you talked about some back of the envelope calculations and also the idea of making short-term versus long-term decisions, and that oftentimes we don't think long-term enough. What are some examples maybe that would be common examples that you've seen on some of those calculations that are maybe short-term or long-term that almost always, in a worst-case scenario, create value?
I would say, Jason, you know, when you're talking about individual animal treatment decisions, you know, should I treat this pig or not treat this pig? I would say almost always, you know, treat the pig, whatever your protocol says. Generally, they're set up with individual treatments based on the clinical side. So if the pig coughed and you're saying, should I treat the pig for respiratory disease? Well, yes, treat the pig for respiratory disease. Whether it is a wean to finish barn, a nursery, a sow farm, a boar stud, you name it. I don't think there's really any situation where you'll go wrong by treating an individual pig. You'll spend more time thinking about should you do it than just doing it. So the individual pig treatments are very straightforward. When I talk about like back of the envelope math, I'm typically talking about, you know, should we use a water medication on this group of growing pigs? We can typically look at the water consumption data and determine how much water is disappearing. We can say, okay, we want to treat these pigs for 5 days or 7 days or whatever, and we want to use X, Y, and Z medication. And most veterinarians, and honestly, most finishing field staff, they know what that medication costs. They know exactly the dosage, and they can figure that stuff up on the fly. So making those decisions without a complicated spreadsheet or an in-depth financial analysis is fantastic. When I think of long-term health decisions, Jason, and maybe an example where people use short-term decisions too often, mycoplasma would be a great example. Mycoplasma pneumonia has been around for decades and decades and decades. And for decades and decades and decades, typically, you know, producers would have a feed medication program to manage it, and a vaccine program. And, you know, if we had other diseases, other respiratory issues like PRRS, influenza, et cetera, we may have to do additional water medication on top of that. Producers have, I think, really appreciated that mycoplasma elimination doesn't mean mycoplasma is never a problem for you again, but you can save a lot of the short-term costs that you're incurring with the feed medication program, the spot treatments with water meds, and typically have much better performance on the pigs. The mycoplasma elimination obviously incurs cost, both costs, you know, direct cost of the elimination products and supplies, but then also indirect costs of maybe not hitting breed target because you run out of gilts, maybe loss of genetic improvement if you're a multiplier that has to close the herd, things like that. But there are certainly a lot of times where producers, if they can cash flow the long-term improvement, will be better off to cash flow the long-term improvement. And one of the things I tried to highlight there is we've got to be respectful of the fact that producers have a budget, and at the end of the day, you know, we can come up with the best long-term solution. But if it's not something that the producer can cash flow in that moment, we just got to be respectful of that.
Thank you. Okay, we got a question in the back.
Hello. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Luis Gonzalez from Smithfield Premium Genetics. I have a question. I love this idea that he said, if you can measure it, you can manage it. So my question is, if there's any study or how can we measure between lines what are the acceptable parameters? Because I've been hearing over the years that a pig is a pig, a sow is a sow, but when you face off the reality, in my case, I'm working with Duroc pigs, so I realize that it's very different, everything. So how can I know if my goals or my parameters that I'm being measured are acceptable? I would like to know if there's any study or how can I set up my goals based on a Duroc line.
Great question, Luis. You know, when I think of acceptable measurements, I think that can be defined within a very small group of people. So your team at Smithfield Premium Genetics, your team could define what is acceptable metrics to measure animal well-being for your team. And if you do that, you don't need to worry about, you know, what does Clayton and Carthage think, or what does Jason and his team think, or anybody else. As long as it's good for you and your coworkers and your group that collectively makes decisions about how you're going to care for those pigs, I think that's reasonable. Because choosing what measurements are most reasonable to measure animal welfare is going to be subjective. Inherently, it's going to be subjective. We measure plenty of things in pig production. So I don't perceive that the measurement needs to be some new metric that we don't already collect data on today. We evaluate body condition of sows. We measure the growth and performance of our pigs and of our sow herds. And we typically have more data than we know what to do with. I think picking the measurements that we're going to say are reflective of animal well-being and effective animal care, that's the subjective part. And the more broadly we try to pick those metrics, so if we try to pick them for the entire industry, that's going to be complicated because we're going to have to get a lot of people to agree that that is the right way to measure animal well-being. So that's where I suggest that it makes probably the most sense to start small. Start with your teammates that you make decisions with, and certainly folks up and down the supply chain from you. But I wouldn't worry about, you know, the National Pork Board or the American Association of Swine Vets or any other, you know, industry groups having to define it collectively for everybody, because that'll be a much more onerous task than just each of us defining with our group of, you know, farm workers, our group of corporate staff, and all the different folks we interact with. I think if we can define it locally and decide we're happy with that, that gives us a benchmark, that gives us a measurement that we can lean to and say, okay, economically, maybe it doesn't say that treating these pigs is going to make the company a huge profit. However, we've agreed that these measurements are important to measure is the well-being of the pigs being well taken care of right now. And if those measurements that maybe aren't directly correlated with profit, if those measurements suggest we should treat these pigs or we should do something to improve the health of these pigs, that gives you guys a benchmark to make that decision in a way that doesn't just consider the immediate short-term economics, but thinks hopefully a little bit more long-term and in the future about the sustainability of your operation.
So I don't have much to add to that. Clayton did a good job with that, but I will just say this in my experience. I wonder how much we actually can do in this front, because at the end of the day, it's perception that matters, right? And when I talk to people, I live in Des Moines or in Ankeny, and I talk to a lot of people that don't know how pigs are raised, but when they see a sow in a crate, it doesn't look right to them. Doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. It just doesn't look right to them, right? Not everybody, but a lot of people I talk to, when they see that, they say, that's not right, right? And so at the end of the day, I don't know, it's challenging, Clayton, to come up with measures that are going to make a difference, I think. So, yeah.
And measurements won't make a difference to everybody. You know, the majority of people in the world are influenced by stories and emotion. They make decisions that way. It's why when we watch commercials on TV, you know, they don't talk about why Ford trucks have the best performance, right? They don't give you data in those commercials. They have Mike Roof talk about how tough you look if you drive a Ford truck, right? Ford tough. If they're trying to sell you cheeseburgers, they're not talking about the nutritional value of the cheeseburgers. They're pulling on the emotional strings. And so I think we need to know our audience, and we need to use communication that's meaningful for them. And if we're talking to technical people, obviously numbers are important. If we're talking to consumers, if we get that opportunity, like on the sow crate thing, the place that I go to, Derald, is its perspective. Whose health and well-being are we trying to protect? When we put the sow into a farrowing crate, into a lactating crate, one of the primary reasons we're confining her movement is so she doesn't crush her piglets. And people are shocked when you explain that the normal behavior of the sow is to crush her piglets to death, to lay on the pigs, and no matter how much they squeal or how much they try to get away, the sow just lays on them. And that was true 40 years ago when sows were being raised outside. It is true today with sows of all different genetics all over the world. And when you try to frame up that ethical discussion of a perspective, looking at right or wrong through differing points of view, and show them that yes, from the sow's point of view, maybe confining her narrowly in that crate isn't ideal. I get that. But if you look at it from the pig's point of view, the piglet's point of view, confining that sow to that area is the best thing you could possibly do to save my life as the piglet. And so I think when you bring the discussion up like that, and when you share it from that perspective, you can at least highlight to people that aren't involved in animal agriculture that there's a lot to this story you don't know and you don't understand. And so we shouldn't ask the general public to define our sow housing standards because they're the least qualified people to make that decision. And hopefully, if nothing else, that conversation shows them that we're involved in pig production, we're involved on the farm, we understand how the farm works. There are no perfect solutions, but we're trying to come up with the best solution that provides the best net value for all the pigs involved, all the people involved, and ultimately makes this thing sustainable into the future.
All right, we'll do one more question here. We're running out of time. Okay.
Hi, Adam Megstad here from Swine Tech. I had a question for your presentation, Rachel Johnson, with regard to the 59% increase in sow mortality from the year 2015 to more modern years. I'm curious what this panel has to say about what you think the leading causes of that increase in mortality are.
Well, I don't know that I can speak to a lot of those specifics. I didn't dig into the reasonings behind that, but I would say we know that POP has been an issue. I think we've seen improvements. PRRS is, of course, an impact. So I think it's just a lot of those disease factors that have caused that increase.
So I think you're going to hear a lot more about that as the conference goes on. But from my perspective, PRRS alone. I graduated from vet school in 1997. By that time, we already knew what PRRS virus was. It was causing problems. And as I've said several times before, I've spent my whole career battling PRRS virus. I'm about ready to retire here shortly. So everybody else in this room can probably say the same thing, right? And the real headache of it is it's not getting better. It gets worse all the time, right? And so, the virus just has evolutionary intelligence, I describe it. It has a way of outsmarting us at every turn. So not saying that's the only reason that we're experiencing higher mortality, but it's certainly a big one. And again, back to the point I made at the end of my presentation, and that is that, we've over the last 30, now 40 years, we've really revolutionized how we raise pigs, right? We went from a kind of an independent producer, farrow to finish, produce their own grain, provide their own labor. Very little, when we do outbreak investigations on those kinds of farms, they're still out there. There's not a lot of stuff coming in and out, right? But compared to like a standalone breed-to-wean farm, you got feed coming in, you got semen coming in, you got trailers coming to pick up wean pigs, coming up call sows, you get gilts coming in. There is a lot of stuff coming in and out. We've created a system that's very efficient from a cost standpoint, but it's still a biological system or production process, and we've made it very open. So we're bringing stuff in and out all the time, right? That is ideal for a virus like PRRS virus to thrive and to continue to evolve and develop and get worse and worse and worse, right? And until we change that, we're never gonna outsmart it, okay? I can say after 30 years of trying, we're not gonna outsmart it, unless there's smarter people in this room than me, and I'm sure there are. But it's not, we're still not, okay, that came off wrong, but we're not gonna outsmart it. I'll just leave it at that. That's not what I did.
All right, well, I think we'll pause here. We have a time for a 30-minute break. We're a little bit over 10:15. So you can step out, take a restroom break, grab a coffee. We'll meet back in here and reconvene at 10:45. If you had other questions, hopefully for Rachel or Derald, you can catch them up here. But let's thank all three of the speakers here.